So, what is it that almost every psychologist, therapist, coach, self help guru, what do they all get wrong? What's the one thing that they all get wrong? I'm Dr. Stephen Brownlow. I'm the founder of Adept Psychology, the author of Emotions in Psychology and Psychotherapy. And the thing is, I think there is something that we all get wrong, and I think we've been getting it wrong since the days of Freud. But before I get to that, let me explain something about myself and how I've come to where I am in life. There's sort of this idea that in psychology, they will say correlation doesn't prove causality. And what that means is just because you see two things together doesn't mean one caused the other. And that's true. But we treat them a lot of times like they do cause each other. So if we see A and B happen together and we know something about A and we don't understand B very well, we think, well, maybe A probably caused B. And so we go try to work on A to see if we can change B. And sometimes if we work on A a little, we change B a little bit. And then we think, oh, well, then this is the thing. Oh, then A must cause B. And so what we notice, and this happens a lot, and so, for instance, couples who don't get along together, we notice that they don't communicate very well. So maybe if we change how they communicate with each other, then we'll change how they get along. Or if we change the roles in the family, then we'll do something about the emotional life in the family. Or if we've noticed that people who recidivate in prison don't have good plans for what they're going to do after they leave. So maybe if we help them write a good plan, then they won't recidivate. Excuse me. So you see this kind of stuff all the time. People who are depressed, we notice that they have really terrible beliefs about themselves. So maybe if we change their beliefs about themselves, they won't be so depressed. Sometimes that happens. It helps a little bit. But in general, all of those things find endpoints where they don't work very well anymore. And so when they quit working, we start thinking, well, maybe I just need to do it better. We need to. And so at this point, I do what I call backwards thinking. And so if you know that correlation doesn't prove causality, okay, maybe A causes B, maybe B causes A, maybe C causes both A and B. Maybe they're unrelated, but it's just coincidence. But that's not likely if you always see them together. And so what I tend to do is I tend to look at things and say, well, if everybody else assumes that A causes B, but they only get piddling results, then what would happen if I assume that B causes A? And that's really kind of how I came to this discovery about what we've been getting wrong since Freud. And what we've been getting wrong since Freud is Freud had this idea that there was something keeping people stuck that had been kind of stuck in place for a long time. And if we got rid of that, if we worked it through somehow, and he changed how working through went over time. First it was just kind of letting it, releasing it, catharsis, and then it was insight, and then it was some nebulous working through, and he never was clear about what that was. But if you work through whatever that is, then everything changes. And he thought it was sexual impulses or sexual instinct. Everybody else kind of thinks, well, no, it's not sexual exactly. It's really kind of more emotional, and they have different ways of working through emotional stuff. And so I was brought up in that. I was a therapist. I was a clinical psychologist. I learned that. I learned that method. But I also realized through a lot of backwards thinking along the way that there were things, instead of working on relationships or thoughts or whatever, why didn't I work on emotions and find distinct ways to work specifically and exactly on emotions and see what that did? And so I developed some techniques and I learned a lot about emotions along the way. And what I realized at some point was that I could go in and do work with myself or with clients, and not only would stuff get released, but then at least for a short period, things would be very loose and fluid, and all of a sudden, all of this stuff would start coming up that was like life purpose and meaning and calling, and people would get really oriented and intuitive, and they would know exactly why they were here and what they were doing, and they would make immense progress in a short period of time. And that was great. I mean, I released some stuff that happened to me. I tried it with other people, and first one client, then another, then another, then another, and they would make these huge gains very quickly. And that's by itself not all that abnormal. I had talked to other therapists before who would say, well, you know, it's amazing how you get to this spot and all of a sudden people will have this period where all of a sudden they have all this self-insight and intuition and it goes away, but you can tell you're really on the right track when it happens. You've really done something. And I asked the question, why did that happen? Why did that happen from releasing those other emotions? And I could never really figure out why. And I was getting stuck because all of my procedures and my theory about why the procedures work was very tight and very elegant until it got to that. And then all of a sudden there were all these complications, and it's like, wait a minute, it can't be complicated. It is easy. What is it that I'm not thinking about? So I looked at it backwards, and I realized at that point that it was never about releasing emotions. It was never about releasing sexual instincts like Freud thought. It was about releasing defenses. And when you release defenses, that's not inevitably, that's not a psychological problem. That's a spiritual problem. That's no longer, I'm releasing something that I've kept that's not me. It's, I'm releasing something that's keeping me from being me. And it's a completely different problem. And so when people ask me, well, gee, you're a psychologist, why do you keep focusing on spiritual stuff? Or how did you get interested in all this spiritual stuff anyway? Or what does spirituality have to do with this? I get the emotional part, but what does spirituality have to do with this? My answer is everything. Because our spiritual lack of ease is broadcast and manifested as our emotional lack of ease, which then becomes our physical dis-ease. So, I'm Dr. Stephen Brownlow. If you are seeing some of this in yourself and you're seeing, oh, gee, I see how maybe my holding on to feeling separate, for instance, or hanging on to some old memory, or keeping people away from me, or something like that, if you can see how that's relating somehow in your life, and it may have something to do, you're starting to get a suspicion it may have something to do with why you can't have what you want in your life, let me tell you that you're on the right track. Let me affirm that. And until we meet again, until the next time I film, just remember, the power is yours. The power has always been yours. You can release your defenses. You can become yourself. You can become who you've always been meant to be.